In the winter of 1938, as Francisco Franco's forces swept through the mountains of Asturias, Spain, a young American war correspondent named Thomas McKinnon stumbled upon something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden in a remote valley near the village of Pays, he discovered the remnants of what local survivors whispered was the most cursed bloodline in all of Spain. Three sisters, Elena Magdalena and Esperanza Calderon, had shared not just a home but a single husband, deliberately creating what medical experts would later call the most genetically isolated family tree in documented European history. For over 80 years, McKinnon's sealed reports have remained buried in the State Department archives in Washington, D.C., after alongside testimonies too disturbing for public consumption. What happened in that forgotten corner of Asturias between 1895 and 1938 challenges everything we thought we knew about family survival and the horrifying lengths people will go to preserve what they believe is their pure bloodline. Before we continue with the story of the Calderon sisters and the terrible discovery that changed one American journalist's life forever, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover the most chilling forgotten stories from around the world that somehow connect back to American history. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts who help us bring these buried tales to light, especially those with Spanish or European ancestry, who might recognize elements of these old-world secrets. The mountains of Eastern Asturias had always been a place where the outside world seemed to forget to look, even as Spain tore itself apart in the brutal civil war of 1936–1939. The remote valleys near the Picos de Europa remained largely untouched by the conflict raging across the rest of the country. It was here in the isolated hamlet of Pang that the Calderon family had made their home for nearly 3 centuries, arriving originally from the Basque territories in the 1642nd as cattle herders and stonemasons. By 1895, the family had dwindled to just one man, Don Aurelio Calderon, and his 3 daughters, Elena, the eldest at 22, Magdalena, 20, and Esperanza, barely 18. Their mother, Compton, had died in childbirth with what would have been a 4th daughter, leaving Aurelio to raise the girls in complete isolation from the handful of other families scattered throughout the valley. The nearest town of any significance was Cangas de Onís, a full day's journey by mule through treacherous mountain paths that became impossible during the harsh winter months. Aurelio Calderon was a man obsessed with what he called the purity of blood, la pureza de sangre. He had spent years studying the family genealogies kept in his father's wooden chest, tracing the Calderon line back through carefully preserved marriage records and birth certificates. What he discovered filled him with both pride and terror. His family had remained remarkably free of what he considered foreign contamination. No marriages to Moors during the medieval period, no unions with conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, and most importantly, no mixing with the local Orient peasantry, whom he viewed as racially inferior. But therein lay his problem. As the only surviving male of the Calderon line, Aurelio faced an impossible choice. If he allowed his daughters to marry outside the family, the bloodline he believed to be sacred would be forever diluted. If he forbade them from marrying at all, the line would die with him. There was, however, a third option, one that had begun to take shape in his increasingly troubled mind during the long, dark winters when the family was completely cut off from the outside world. The 3 Calderon sisters had been raised to believe they were fundamentally different from other people. Their father had filled their heads with stories of their noble ancestry, claiming they were descended from Gothic kings and that their blood carried special properties that must be preserved at all costs. Elena, with her sharp features and piercing grey eyes, had become her father's primary confidant in his genealogical obsessions. Magdalena, softer and more questioning, often wondered about the world beyond their valley, but had been taught that such curiosity was a sign of moral weakness. Esperanza, the youngest, had been born with a slight limp that her father interpreted as a mark of their family's ancient nobility, a physical sign, he claimed, that appeared in only the purest bloodlines. The isolation had shaped them in ways that would have horrified any outside observer. By 1895, the sisters spoke a dialect that was almost incomprehensible to other Spanish speakers, mixing archaic Castilian with Asturian, and even fragments of what appeared to be medieval Latin. They wore clothing styles that had been out of fashion for decades, hand-sewn from patterns that had been passed down through generations. Most disturbing of all, they had developed a relationship with each other and their father that blurred every normal boundary of family life. As winter approached in 1895, Aurelio Calderon made a decision that would echo through the decades and eventually reach the ears of a young American journalist 4 decades later. He called his daughters together in the main room of their stone farmhouse and presented them with what he called a sacred duty. He had found, he told them, the perfect solution to preserve their bloodline while ensuring its continuation. The sisters would share a single husband, a distant cousin named Rodrigo Calderon, whom he had located in a village near Santander. Rodrigo, he assured them, was of pure Calderon blood, traced back through his grandfather to the same ancestor they all shared. What Aurelio didn't tell his daughters was that Rodrigo Calderon was not a distant cousin at all. He was Aurelio's own son by his deceased sister, a fact that would make him the girl's half-brother. The deception was carefully crafted, supported by forged documents that Aurelio had spent months preparing. In his twisted logic, this arrangement would not only preserve their bloodline, but would actually purify it further, creating children whose genetic heritage would be more concentrated than any in their family's history. The arrangement he proposed was methodical and cold in its calculation. Each sister would spend 1 month as Rodrigo's primary wife, while the other 2 served as companions and assistants. Any children born from these unions would be raised collectively with their specific parentage, deliberately obscured to prevent favoritism. The sisters would live together in harmony, united in their sacred mission to create the purest possible offspring. Elena, ever the beautiful daughter, accepted immediately. Magdalena voiced concerns, but was quickly silenced by her father's theological arguments about divine will and family honor. Only Esperanza seemed to understand the full horror of what was being proposed, but her protests were dismissed as the hysteria of youth. Within a month, Rodrigo Calderon had arrived from Santander, a hollow-eyed man of 35 who seemed to understand his role all too well. The winter of 1896 brought with it a silence that seemed to swallow the entire Calderon Valley. The first snows had fallen earlier than usual, sealing the family's stone farmhouse away from the outside world until spring. It was during these months of complete isolation that the true nature of Aurelio's plan began to reveal itself, and what had seemed merely disturbing evolved into something far more sinister. Rodrigo Calderon had arrived in November, just as the mountain passes were becoming treacherous. He was a man marked by hardship, his face weathered beyond his years, and his hands bearing the calluses of someone who had known manual labor since childhood. But there was something else about him, a peculiar intensity in his dark eyes, and a way of speaking that suggested he understood far more about the Calderon family's true history than he initially let on. The arrangement began exactly as Aurelio had planned. Elena, as the eldest, was given the first month to establish herself as Rodrigo's primary wife. The ceremony that united them was performed by Aurelio himself, using a combination of Catholic ritual and what he claimed were ancient family traditions passed down from their Gothic ancestors. There were no outside witnesses, no civil registration, no connection to the church in Cangasque, Dion. It was, in every legal sense, not a marriage at all, but rather a carefully orchestrated breeding arrangement disguised as religious duty. What happened during that first month would haunt the valley for decades to come. Elena, who had always been the most compliant of the sisters, began to change in ways that neither Magdalena nor Esperanza could understand. She became secretive, whispering with Rodrigo in corners of the house and developing what could only be described as an obsession with their father's genealogical charts. She spent hours copying names and dates, creating elaborate family trees that showed the theoretical genetic makeup of any children she might bear. But it was during the long evenings when the family gathered around the fire in the main room that the true horror of the situation began to reveal itself. Rodrigo would speak of his childhood in ways that didn't align with the story Aurelio had told about his origins. He mentioned places near Piney's that no distant cousin should have known about, recalled people and events from the valley's past with an intimacy that suggested deep personal knowledge, and most disturbing of all, he bore a striking physical resemblance to Aurelio himself. The same narrow nose, the same distinctive cleft in his chin, the same unusual grey eyes that marked the Calderon bloodline. Magdalena was the first to voice her suspicions. During the second month, when she had become Rodrigo's primary companion, she began asking pointed questions about his family history. Her inquiries were met with evasive answers and, more troublingly, with violent anger from her father. Aurelio's reaction to any questioning of Rodrigo's background was so extreme that it confirmed Magdalena's worst fears. There was something fundamentally wrong with the entire arrangement. It was Esperanza, however, who uncovered the truth. On a February night in 1897, when a fierce blizzard had trapped the family inside for 3 days, she discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath her father's mattress. The correspondence, dating back over 2 decades, revealed the full scope of Aurelio's deception and the true identity of the man who was now cycling through marriages with all 3 sisters. The letters were from Aurelio's sister, Carmen, who had died in 1862, shortly after giving birth to an illegitimate son. The father's identity was never recorded, but the dates and circumstances made it clear that Aurelio himself was responsible. Carmen had died in childbirth at the Calderon farmhouse, and the infant, Rodrigo, had been sent away to be raised by distant relatives in Santander. The boy had grown up knowing nothing of his true parentage, believing himself to be an orphaned cousin of the Calderon family. But the letters revealed something even more disturbing. Aurelio had been corresponding with Rodrigo for over 5 years, gradually revealing selected portions of the family history while carefully concealing the true nature of their relationship. He had convinced the young man that he was a distant cousin with an obligation to help preserve the family bloodline, never mentioning that such preservation would involve marrying and impregnating his own half-sisters. The psychological impact of this discovery on Esperanza was immediate and devastating. She confronted her father that very night, demanding an explanation for what she correctly identified as not just incest, but a form of generational abuse that had been decades in the planning. Aurelio's response was calm, methodical, and utterly chilling in its logic. He explained that the traditional definitions of family relationships were irrelevant when dealing with bloodlines as pure and ancient as theirs. The normal taboos, he claimed, applied only to common people who had already diluted their genetic heritage through generations of careless breeding. For families like the Calderons, who had maintained their purity across centuries, different rules applied. What others might call incest, he termed genetic refinement. What they might call abuse, he called sacred duty. Moreover, he argued, the results would speak for themselves. The children born from these unions would possess qualities that no ordinary breeding could produce: intelligence, beauty, and spiritual gifts that came only from the careful concentration of superior bloodlines. They would be, in his words, the perfection that God intended before sin introduced chaos into the natural order. Esperanza's horror at these revelations was matched only by her growing realization that there was no escape from the situation. The winter had made leaving impossible, but even when spring arrived, where could she go? She had no money, no connections to the outside world, and no understanding of how to survive beyond the valley that had been her entire universe. More importantly, both Elena and Magdalena were already showing signs of pregnancy, binding them permanently to the nightmare that Aurelio had created. As the snows finally began to melt in March of 1897, Esperanza made a decision that would haunt the Calderon family for the next 4 decades. Rather than flee or continue to fight against the arrangement, she would stay and document everything. She began keeping a detailed record of daily life in the household, the development of her sister's pregnancies, and most importantly, the gradual changes in behavior and appearance that began to manifest in the children who would soon be born. The first generation of Calderon children arrived in the autumn of 1897, and with them came confirmation of Esperanza's worst fears about the consequences of her father's genetic experiments. Elena gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl she named Alonso and Comption, while Magdalena delivered a single daughter, whom she called Carame after the aunt none of them had ever known existed. The births themselves were difficult, requiring Aurelio to serve as midwife, since no outside medical help was available during the early snow season. From their earliest days, the children displayed characteristics that marked them as different from any offspring that might have resulted from normal unions. All three were born with the distinctive grey eyes that had become the hallmark of the Calderon bloodline, but their physical features showed signs of what Esperanza recognized as the inevitable consequences of concentrated breeding. Alfonso had a pronounced underbite that made speech difficult, while Comption's fingers were webbed between the knuckles in a way that suggested developmental abnormalities. Carmen appeared the most normal of the three, but as she grew, it became clear that her hearing was severely limited, forcing the family to communicate with her through an elaborate system of hand signals. More disturbing than the physical abnormalities, however, were the behavioral traits that emerged as the children developed. By age 3, all three displayed an unusual preoccupation with family relationships, asking questions about parentage and bloodlines that seemed far beyond their years. They showed no interest in games or activities typical of young children, instead spending hours studying the genealogical charts that covered the walls of the farmhouse. Most unnervingly, they seemed to understand instinctively that they were part of something secret and important, displaying a level of discretion about family matters that was both remarkable and deeply unsettling. The children's development coincided with significant changes in the adult household structure. By 1900, the original arrangement of rotating marriages had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Elena, Magdalena, and Esperanza had all borne additional children, a total of 8 offspring by 1905. But the question of specific parentage had become deliberately obscured. Rodrigo continued to cycle through relationships with all 3 sisters, but now the older children were beginning to participate in family planning discussions, offering opinions about genetic combinations and bloodline preservation that chilled Esperanza to her core. The isolation that had originally enabled Aurelio's plan now became essential to its continuation. The growing family could not risk discovery by outside authorities who would inevitably view their arrangement as criminal. This meant that the children received no formal education, no medical care, and no exposure to normal social relationships. They learned to read and write from family documents, studied mathematics through genealogical calculations, and developed their understanding of the world entirely through their grandfather's lectures on blood purity and genetic superiority. As the first decade of the new century progressed, Aurelio's health began to decline, and with it came an increasing urgency to establish the second generation of his breeding program. Alfonso, despite his physical limitations, was being groomed to eventually take over the role of family patriarch. His sisters and cousins were being evaluated for their potential as breeding partners with detailed charts, tracking their genetic characteristics and projected offspring qualities. The horror of this situation was compounded by the children's complete acceptance of their predetermined roles. They had been raised to believe that normal family structures were corrupt and inferior, and that their unique arrangement represented a higher form of human organization. When Alonso reached puberty in 1910, he began expressing enthusiasm for the day when he would be able to contribute to the family's genetic mission, viewing his future relationships with his sisters and cousins not as abuse, but as sacred responsibility. It was during this period that Esperanza began to plan her escape, not for herself. She recognized that she was now too deeply implicated in the family's crimes to ever find redemption, but for any potential rescue of the younger children who might still be saved from the cycle of abuse. Her documentation of family life had grown into a comprehensive record of 3 generations of systematic incest, genetic manipulation, and psychological conditioning that she hoped might someday serve as evidence for authorities who could intervene. But Esperanza's plans for intervention were complicated by the political upheaval that was beginning to affect even their remote corner of Aureus. The social tensions that would eventually explode into civil war were already visible in the late 1910 with increasing government instability and reduced administrative oversight in rural areas. The chaos that was brewing across Spain would actually provide additional cover for the Calderon family's activities, allowing them to continue their genetic experiments without fear of discovery. By 1920, the second generation had begun reproducing with Alonso, fathering children by both his sister Comption and his cousin Carmen. The resulting offspring displayed even more pronounced abnormalities than their parents, including several children born with severe developmental delays and physical deformities that made survival difficult in their primitive conditions. Yet rather than viewing these outcomes as evidence of the failure of his plan, Aurelio, now in his 72nd, but still mentally sharp, interpreted them as necessary steps in the purification process, claiming that the weak children were simply the genetic chaff that had to be eliminated before true perfection could be achieved. The family had also developed elaborate justifications for the high infant mortality rate that plagued their breeding program. Children who died young were said to have been called back to God because their genetic mission was complete. Those who survived were viewed as having been specially chosen to carry the bloodline forward. This theological framework helped the adults cope with the reality that roughly half of the children born into the family died before reaching adulthood, usually from complications related to genetic disorders or the primitive medical care available in their isolated compound. As the 1922nd progressed, the Calderon family had grown into a small community of nearly 30 individuals, all descended from the original 3 sisters and their shared husband. The farmhouse had been expanded multiple times to accommodate the growing population, but the basic structure of life remained unchanged. Careful genetic planning, systematic intermarriage, and complete isolation from the outside world. They had created in essence their own closed society with its own rules, values, and understanding of human relationships that bore no resemblance to normal civilization. The autumn of 1930 brought with it changes that would ultimately lead to the family's discovery 8 years later. Spain was entering a period of political instability that would culminate in the Second Republic and eventually civil war. But for the Calderon family, the immediate concern was more personal. Aurelio's death at age 85 had left them without their founding patriarch and genetic strategist. Alonso, now 33, and bearing the physical marks of concentrated inbreeding, premature balding, a severe tremor in his hands, and teeth that had never properly formed, had assumed leadership of the family's breeding program, but his intellectual capacity, limited by developmental delays, made him ill-equipped to manage the complex genealogical calculations that his grandfather had used to guide mating decisions. The responsibility fell instead to his sister, Comption, who had inherited not only Aurelio's obsession with genetic purity, but also his calculating intelligence and ruthless pragmatism. Under Comption's leadership, the family's practices became even more systematic and disturbing. She established what she called breeding schedules, determining which family members would reproduce, with whom, based on detailed analysis of previous offspring quality and genetic combinations that had not yet been attempted. She also instituted regular genetic assessments of all family members, measuring physical characteristics, testing mental capabilities, and evaluating what she termed bloodline indicators to optimize future breeding decisions. The third generation of Calderon children, now numbering over 20 individuals, displayed the cumulative effects of 40 years of deliberate inbreeding. Physical deformities had become so common that the family had developed specialized techniques for caring for children born with cleft palates, club feet, and various forms of skeletal malformation. Mental disabilities ranged from mild learning difficulties to severe developmental delays that left some family members unable to care for themselves. Yet, these outcomes were still viewed as acceptable casualties in the pursuit of genetic perfection. More disturbing than the physical and mental abnormalities, however, was the psychological conditioning that had shaped the third generation's understanding of normal human relationships. Children who had been raised from birth to view their siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles as potential breeding partners displayed a complete absence of natural incest to boss. They spoke casually about family planning decisions, evaluated their relatives' genetic qualities with clinical detachment, and accepted their predetermined roles in the breeding program with enthusiasm that would have horrified any outside observer. The family's isolation had also produced cultural changes that set them apart from mainstream Spanish society in fundamental ways. Their language had evolved into a dialect that incorporated technical genetic terminology with archaic religious concepts, creating a vocabulary that was virtually incomprehensible to outsiders. Their clothing, still handmade according to patterns from the 1892nd, marked them immediately as belonging to some earlier era. Most significantly, their understanding of time, history, and the outside world remained frozen in the period of their founding, making them living anachronisms in a rapidly modernizing country. It was during this period that Esperanza, now 53 and showing signs of the premature aging common among the family's breeding females, made a decision that would ultimately lead to their discovery. She had spent decades documenting the family's activities in journals hidden throughout the farmhouse compound. But she now recognized that her records would be meaningless unless they somehow reached outside authorities. The question was how to make contact with the outside world without destroying the family she had helped to create and perpetuate. Her solution was both ingenious and desperate. She began leaving carefully crafted messages in locations where they might be discovered by the occasional travelers who passed through the valley, hunters, government surveyors, or merchants traveling between Cangas and Santander. These messages were written in standard Spanish rather than the family's evolved dialect, and they contained just enough information to intrigue potential readers without revealing the full scope of the Calderon family's activities. The messages described a unique community in the mountains that had preserved ancient Spanish traditions and might be of interest to scholars studying historical social structures. They included general directions to the farmhouse compound and suggested that visitors would be welcome if they approached with proper respect for traditional ways of life. Esperanza hoped that these messages would eventually attract the attention of someone with the authority and understanding necessary to intervene in the situation. Her plan might have worked, but political events in Spain were moving toward crisis faster than her careful preparations could bear fruit. The Second Spanish Republic, established in 1931, was marked by increasing social and political polarization that made normal government administration difficult. Even in accessible areas in remote regions like the Calderon Valley, administrative oversight became virtually non-existent as officials focused on more pressing national concerns. The outbreak of civil war in July 1936 effectively ended any possibility that Esperanza's messages would receive official attention. Spain was consuming itself in a conflict that pitted fascists against republicans, conservatives against revolutionaries, Catholics against secularists. The remote valleys of eastern Aureus became refugees for deserters, hideouts for political fugitives, and no-man's lands where normal law enforcement ceased to function. For the Calderon family, the civil war represented both opportunity and danger. The breakdown of government authority meant they could continue their activities without fear of official interference, but it also brought armed groups and desperate individuals into their previously secure territory. By 1937, they were encountering soldiers, refugees, and bandits with increasing frequency, forcing them to develop strategies for dealing with outsiders while protecting their secrets. The family's response to this challenge revealed the full extent of their psychological transformation. Rather than viewing the war as an opportunity to escape their isolated existence, they interpreted it as confirmation of the superiority of their closed society. The violence and chaos of the outside world, they believed, proved that normal human relationships were inherently corrupt and destructive. Their own carefully controlled breeding program, by contrast, had created a community based on genetic excellence and social harmony. This interpretation allowed them to rationalize increasingly extreme measures to protect their isolation. Family members who expressed interest in the outside world were subjected to re-education sessions designed to reinforce their commitment to genetic purity. Children who showed signs of wanting to leave were confined to the compound until they demonstrated proper devotion to family goals. Most disturbing of all, the few outsiders who accidentally discovered their location were either recruited into the family structure or eliminated as threats to their genetic mission. The winter of 1937-1938 brought with it a series of events that would ultimately lead to the discovery that changed Thomas McKinnon's life forever. The Civil War was entering its final phase, with Franco's nationalist forces gaining ground throughout northern Spain. Aureus, a Republican stronghold, was experiencing the brutal suppression that would characterize the early years of the Franco dictatorship. Government forces were conducting systematic searches of remote areas, looking for Republican fugitives, weapons caches, and evidence of political resistance. It was during one of these searches that a detachment of Guardia Civil first encountered evidence of the Calderon family's existence. In December 1937, A patrol following reports of Republican activity in the Pine Valley discovered one of Esperanza's messages tucked into the ruins of an abandoned shepherd's hut. The note, written in her careful script, described a traditional Spanish community that had maintained pure bloodlines for generations and invited proper authorities to visit their ancestral home. The commanding officer, Sergeant Miguel Renteria, initially dismissed the message as the fantasy of some hermit or the ravings of a war refugee, but something about the precise language and the specific geographical references convinced him that it warranted investigation. More importantly, the valley described in the message was exactly the type of remote location where Republican fighters might establish hideouts or weapons depots. The patrol's approach to the Calderon compound in January 1938 marked the beginning of a confrontation that had been decades in the making. The family, now numbering 43 individuals, ranging from infants to elderly adults, had developed elaborate protocols for dealing with outside threats. These protocols, refined through encounters with various wartime intruders, involved a combination of misdirection, intimidation, and, when necessary, elimination of witnesses. The Guardia Civil Patrol's first glimpse of the compound was startling enough, a collection of stone buildings that seemed frozen in time, inhabited by people wearing clothing styles from a previous century and speaking a dialect that was barely recognizable as Spanish. But as Sergeant Renteria and his men began investigating the community more closely, they discovered evidence of activities that defied comprehension. The family's genealogical charts covering every wall of the main farmhouse revealed a pattern of intermarriage that could only be described as systematic incest spanning multiple generations. Birth records meticulously maintained by Aurelio and later by Compton documented the parentage of dozens of children whose genetic heritage violated every social and religious norm of Spanish society. Most disturbing of all, the family members themselves spoke openly about their breeding practices, viewing them not as shameful secrets, but as achievements worthy of pride. Sergeant Renteria, a career military officer who had seen the worst horrors of civil war, found himself confronted with something that challenged his understanding of human nature itself. This was not the crude abuse that occasionally surfaced in isolated rural communities, but rather a sophisticated multi-generational program of genetic manipulation that had been conducted with scientific precision and religious fervor. The initial confrontation might have ended with the arrest of the adult family members and the placement of children in state custody, but events took a different turn due to the presence of someone unexpected among the Guardia Civil Patrol. Thomas McKinnon, the American war correspondent, who would later write the sealed reports that documented the full scope of the Calderon family's activities, had been accompanying the patrol as part of his coverage of the Civil War's final phase. McKinnon, a 28-year-old journalist working for several American newspapers, had requested permission to observe military operations in rural Aureus as background for articles about the war's impact on traditional Spanish society. He was particularly interested in how isolated communities had been affected by the conflict, making him an ideal witness to the discovery of a family that had remained completely untouched by external events for over 4 decades. McKinnon's presence changed the dynamic of the encounter in crucial ways. As an American civilian with no direct stake in Spanish political conflicts, he was able to approach the situation with an objectivity that would have been impossible for Spanish authorities. More importantly, his background as a journalist trained him to document evidence and preserve testimony in ways that would prove invaluable in understanding the full scope of what had occurred in the Calderon Valley. The American correspondent's initial reaction to the family was a combination of fascination and horror that would shape his reporting for decades to come. He recognized immediately that he was witnessing something unprecedented in modern European history, a closed society that had deliberately isolated itself from normal human civilization in pursuit of genetic goals that bordered on scientific fantasy. But McKinnon also recognized that the timing of the discovery created enormous complications for any official response. Spain was in the midst of a brutal civil war that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions more. The new Franco government was focused on political consolidation and the suppression of Republican resistance. The last thing Spanish authorities wanted to deal with was a scandal involving systematic incest in a remote mountain community. The solution that emerged from discussions between Sergeant Rateria and McKinnon reflected the pragmatic realities of wartime governance. The Calderon family would be quietly relocated to separate institutions where the children could receive proper care and education while the adults face prosecution for their crimes. The case would be handled discreetly to avoid creating publicity that might embarrass the new government or provide propaganda material for Republican opponents. McKinnon's role in this arrangement was crucial. As an American journalist with international connections, he could ensure that the case received proper documentation and that the children's welfare was protected during the transition process. In exchange, he would agree to delay publication of his findings until Spanish authorities had completed their investigation and achieved some resolution of the situation. What none of them anticipated was that the temporary delay in publication would stretch across decades, ultimately becoming a permanent silence that would leave the Calderon family story buried in classified archives until long after all the participants were dead. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Pains Valley intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of the most isolated bloodline in European history. The full scope of the Calderon family's genetic experiments was revealed during a week-long investigation in February 1938 that McKinnon would later describe as descending into a living nightmare that challenged everything I thought I knew about human civilization. Working alongside Spanish medical authorities who had been quietly brought in to assess the situation, the American correspondent documented evidence of systematic breeding practices that had produced results both more extensive and more disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. The medical examinations of the family members revealed patterns of genetic abnormalities that painted a clear picture of the consequences of concentrated inbreeding. Dr. Carlos Mendizabal, a geneticist from the University of Salamanca, who had been sworn to secrecy about the case, concluded that the Calderon family represented the most genetically isolated human population in documented history, with levels of genetic homozygosity that exceeded anything previously recorded in scientific literature. The physical manifestations of this genetic concentration were evident throughout the family. Nearly every member displayed some form of developmental abnormality, ranging from relatively minor issues like unusual dental formations and skeletal irregularities to severe problems, including profound mental retardation, congenital deafness, and various forms of organ malformation. The infant mortality rate had been approximately 60%, with most deaths occurring within the first year of life due to complications related to genetic disorders. But the physical abnormalities, horrifying as they were, palled in comparison to the psychological impact of the family's breeding practices on survivors. The children and young adults who had reached maturity within the compound displayed a complete absence of normal social development. They had been raised to view their siblings, parents, and cousins exclusively through the lens of genetic utility, evaluating family relationships based on potential breeding outcomes rather than emotional bonds. McKinnon's interviews with family members revealed the full extent of their psychological conditioning. Conception, now the family's primary leader, spoke with clinical detachment about her role in selecting breeding pairs and monitoring pregnancy outcomes. She maintained detailed records not only of genetic combinations but also of performance evaluations for family members, rating their contributions to the genetic improvement program with numerical scores that determined their status within the family hierarchy. The children, ranging in age from infants to young adults, demonstrated levels of indoctrination that McKinnon found almost impossible to comprehend. They spoke casually about their predetermined roles in future breeding schedules, evaluated their own siblings as potential partners with scientific objectivity, and expressed genuine enthusiasm for their participation in what they had been taught to view as a sacred mission of genetic purification. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of Esperanza's hidden journals, which provided a day-by-day account of the family's development over 4 decades. Her meticulously maintained records documented not only the breeding decisions and their outcomes, but also the psychological techniques that had been used to maintain family cohesion and prevent rebellion against the system. The journals revealed that several family members had indeed attempted to escape over the years, but they had been systematically hunted down, subjected to brutal correction processes, and either returned to compliance or eliminated as threats to family security. The escape attempts had led to the development of increasingly sophisticated control mechanisms. Family members were forbidden from traveling alone beyond the immediate compound area. Children were subjected to regular loyalty testing, designed to identify potential dissident before they could act on rebellious impulses. Most effectively, the family had developed an elaborate system of mutual surveillance, with family members required to report any signs of disloyalty or desire to leave the community. These control mechanisms had been justified through a complex ideological framework that combined distorted Catholic theology with pseudo-scientific theories about genetic superiority. Family members were taught that they were engaged in God's work of purifying humanity, and that any betrayal of their mission would result not only in personal damnation, but also in the corruption of the entire human species. This theological justification made resistance to the system virtually impossible for individuals who had been raised within its confines. The investigation also revealed the full extent of the family's isolation from normal Spanish society. They had developed their own currency system based on genetic contributions rather than monetary exchange. Their calendar was organized around breeding cycles rather than religious or civil holidays. Most significantly, they had created their own legal system, with conception serving as judge, jury, and executioner for any violations of family genetic policies. McKinnon's most chilling discovery came when he examined the family's plans for expansion. Far from being satisfied with their current population, the leadership had developed elaborate strategies for recruiting new genetic material from outside sources. They had identified several other isolated families in the region that might be suitable for absorption into their breeding program, and they had begun making contact with these potential targets through carefully crafted deception campaigns. The recruitment strategy involved approaching isolated families during times of crisis, deaths, economic hardship, or political persecution, and offering assistance in exchange for marriage alliances. Young adults from target families would be invited to join the Calderon compound as spouses for family members, but they would not be informed about the true nature of the community until after they had been physically and psychologically trapped within the system. Several such recruitments had already been successful. McKinnon discovered evidence that at least 6 individuals from outside families had been absorbed into the Calderon genetic program over the previous decade. These recruits had been systematically isolated from their original families, subjected to intensive indoctrination processes, and eventually integrated into the breeding schedule as if they had been born into the system. The fate of those who resisted integration was documented in Esperanza's journals with clinical precision. Individuals who refused to participate in the breeding program were subjected to increasing levels of psychological and physical coercion until they either complied or were deemed irredeemable. Those in the latter category simply disappeared from the records with brief notations indicating they had been returned to God or had chosen to seek their fortune elsewhere. McKinnon's investigation revealed that the family had developed sophisticated techniques for disposing of both resistant recruits and genetically defective offspring. A series of unmarked graves in the forest surrounding the compound contained the remains of at least 20 individuals whose deaths had never been reported to civil authorities. The graves were organized in a methodical pattern that suggested regular use over an extended period, indicating that elimination of unsuitable individuals had become a routine aspect of the family's genetic management system. The American correspondent's final discovery was perhaps the most disturbing of all, evidence that the family's activities had been known to certain Spanish authorities for years, but had been deliberately ignored due to the remote location and the political chaos of the Civil War period. Local priests had received reports about the family's unusual practices, but had dismissed them as rural superstitions. Government officials had been informed about missing persons in the region, but had attributed the disappearances to war-related violence rather than investigating them systematically. This official negligence had enabled the family to operate with complete impunity for over 4 decades, expanding their genetic experiments and recruitment activities while remaining essentially invisible to the outside world. The discovery in 1938 had occurred not because of any systematic effort to investigate rural communities, but purely by accident during a military patrol that had been searching for Republican fugitives. The realization that such extensive criminal activity could continue undetected for so long raised profound questions about the effectiveness of government oversight in rural Spain and the vulnerability of isolated populations to predatory exploitation. McKinnon recognized that the Calderon case represented not just an isolated incident of family dysfunction, but a systematic failure of social institutions that had serious implications for the protection of vulnerable populations throughout the country. The dismantling of the Calderon family compound in March 1938 required a carefully coordinated effort involving medical professionals, social workers, and security personnel who had been sworn to absolute secrecy about the operation. The Spanish authorities, already overwhelmed by the challenges of post-Civil War reconstruction, were determined to handle the situation with minimal publicity that might embarrass the new Franco government or create international complications. McKinnon watched as 43 individuals were systematically removed from the only world most of them had ever known and distributed among various institutions across northern Spain. The youngest children, those under age 10, were placed in Catholic orphanages where they could receive proper education and hopefully overcome the psychological damage of their early conditioning. The older children and young adults were sent to specialized facilities that combined medical treatment for their genetic disorders with intensive rehabilitation programs designed to prepare them for eventual integration into normal society. The adult family members faced a more complex fate. Conception and several other leaders of the breeding program were quietly prosecuted for crimes including incest, child abuse, kidnapping, and multiple counts of murder. However, their trials were conducted in closed sessions with sealed records to prevent public knowledge of the case. Most received lengthy prison sentences, though several died in custody within a few years due to the effects of genetic disorders and the stress of adapting to life outside their isolated community. Esperanza, whose journals had provided crucial evidence for understanding the family's activities, presented authorities with a particular dilemma. Her detailed documentation had made the investigation possible, but she was also clearly complicit in decades of criminal activity. The solution was to offer her immunity from prosecution in exchange for continued cooperation with researchers studying the genetic and psychological effects of extreme isolation and inbreeding. Under this arrangement, Esperanza spent her remaining years working with Dr. Mindy Zabal and other scientists who were attempting to understand the full implications of the Calderon case. Her insights into the family's psychological conditioning techniques and genetic selection processes provided valuable data for research that would later inform policies on child protection and the detection of isolated abuse situations. The physical compound itself was thoroughly documented and then systematically destroyed. McKinnon participated in this process, photographing every room, cataloging every document, and preserving evidence that would later be sealed in Spanish government archives. The genealogical charts that had covered the walls were carefully copied before being burned, creating a permanent record of what Dr. Mendy Zarabal called the most comprehensive documentation of human inbreeding ever assembled. The unmarked graves in the surrounding forest were excavated and their contents subjected to careful analysis. The remains of 23 individuals were recovered, ranging from infants who had died shortly after birth to adults who appeared to have been murdered when they attempted to leave the family or resisted its breeding requirements. Each set of remains told a story of the systematic violence that had been necessary to maintain the family's genetic isolation. McKinnon's role in the aftermath of the discovery proved to be both professionally challenging and personally traumatic. His initial agreement to delay publication while Spanish authorities handled the situation seemed reasonable, but as months stretched into years without any resolution, He began to realize that the case would never be made public through official channels. The Franco government had too much invested in projecting an image of traditional Spanish values and social stability to risk the international embarrassment that would result from revealing the existence of such an extensive incest operation. The American correspondent made several attempts to publish his findings through international media outlets, but he was consistently blocked by a combination of Spanish government pressure and editorial reluctance to print stories that seemed too extreme to be credible. The few editors who were willing to consider publication demanded corroborating sources and official confirmation that the Spanish authorities were unwilling to provide. Frustrated by these obstacles, Mackinnon eventually decided to deposit his complete documentation with the US State Department, hoping that future researchers or journalists might be able to access the materials when political conditions changed. His sealed report, filed in 1940, included thousands of pages of testimony, hundreds of photographs, and detailed genealogical records that provided a comprehensive picture of the Calderon family's 4 decades of genetic experimentation. The fate of the surviving family members varied considerably depending on their age, physical condition, and psychological adaptability. The youngest children, those who had been removed before age 5, generally succeeded in adapting to normal social environments and eventually integrated into Spanish society with little evidence of their unusual origins. Several of these children were adopted by families who were never told about their background, allowing them to grow up without the stigma of their genetic heritage. The older children and adolescents faced more significant challenges. Many suffered from physical disabilities that required ongoing medical treatment, while others displayed psychological problems that made social integration difficult or impossible. Some spent their entire lives in institutional care, never fully overcoming the conditioning they had received during their early years in the compound. Perhaps most tragically, several of the rescued family members proved unable to adapt to life in the outside world and repeatedly attempted to return to the mountains where their compound had been located. These individuals had been so thoroughly conditioned to view their isolated existence as superior to normal society that they experienced the broader world as chaotic, corrupt, and spiritually inferior. At least 3 former family members committed suicide, rather than continue living in what they perceived as an alien and hostile environment. The long-term impact of the Calderon case extended far beyond the immediate fate of the family members themselves. Dr. Mendizabal's research on the genetic effects of extreme inbreeding contributed to important advances in understanding hereditary disorders and the medical consequences of genetic isolation. His work also influenced the development of screening programs designed to identify and assist other isolated communities that might be vulnerable to similar forms of systematic abuse. More broadly, the case highlighted the need for improved oversight of rural populations and better protection for individuals living in remote areas where traditional social controls might break down. The Spanish government, despite its reluctance to publicize the Calderon case, did implement new policies requiring regular visits to isolated communities by social workers and medical personnel. Mackinnon's sealed report remained classified for over 40 years, finally becoming available to researchers in the 1982nd as part of a broader declassification of Spanish Civil War-era documents. Even then, access was restricted to qualified academic researchers who agreed to maintain the anonymity of surviving family members and their descendants. The American correspondent himself was profoundly changed by his encounter with the Calderon family. He continued his journalism career for several more decades, covering conflicts and social issues throughout Europe and Latin America, but colleagues noted that he never again displayed the same optimism about human nature that had characterized his earlier work. In interviews conducted near the end of his life, Mackinnon described the Calderon case as a glimpse into the darkness that exists within human beings when all social constraints are removed and all moral boundaries are abandoned. The final chapter of the Calderon story came in 1983, when Esperanza died in a Madrid nursing home at the age of 96. She had spent the last 4 decades of her life working with researchers and occasionally meeting with journalists who had gained access to the declassified materials until the very end. She maintained that the family's breeding program, despite its horrific consequences, had been motivated by genuine beliefs about genetic improvement and human perfection. Her death marked the end of living memory of the family's activities, but the documentation she had helped to preserve continued to provide valuable insights for researchers studying extreme social isolation, systematic abuse, and the psychological mechanisms that enable ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty. The Calderon case became a standard reference in academic literature on family dysfunction, genetic counseling, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Today, the valley where the Calderon compound once stood remains largely uninhabited. Local residents still speak in whispers about the cursed family that once lived there, and occasional hikers report finding remnants of stone foundations in the forest. The Spanish government has never acknowledged the case publicly, and official records of the investigation remain sealed under laws protecting family privacy and state security. Yet the legacy of the Calderon sisters and their shared husband continues to influence our understanding of human behavior under extreme conditions. Their story serves as a reminder that civilization is a fragile construct, easily corrupted when isolation and fanatical ideology combine to create closed systems immune to outside scrutiny and moral correction. This dark chapter of Spanish history shows us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings from folklore, but rather ordinary people who convince themselves that their terrible actions serve some higher purpose. The Calderon family believed they were creating genetic perfection, but they produced only suffering, disability, and death, a testament to the corrupting power of absolute isolation and the human capacity for self-deception in service of twisted ideals. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be other isolated communities still hidden away from the world pursuing their own dark visions of human improvement? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this haunting tale from the mountains of Asturias. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of history's most disturbing family secrets, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker mysteries of our past. We'll see you in the next episode where we continue uncovering the buried horrors that shaped our world.